Hey, we're identifying points in the Cartesian plane. This is number 2. And the interesting with this question is they mention these words independent and dependent variables. So I want you to remember that the independent variable is the one that we're always going to label as x, and the dependent variable is the one that we're always going to label as y. That's, again, a convention that mathematicians use in order to be able to talk to each other so they agree on which one is which. The independent is always the x, and the dependent is always the y. And what makes a variable dependent or independent? Well, it's easier if we think about the dependent for a second. So the y is the dependent, whereas the x is the independent. And the dependent is called dependent because it depends on x. In other words, the value of the y will always depend on what the x is. So as I change x, I affect the y. The value of the y is the one that depends. So if we take a look at the example over here where we have Amanda who's working, and she has a job working for the city, and she makes $40 after working for 2 hours, and after 6 hours she makes $100. So I want you to be thinking about these two concepts here. We've got this issue of hours, the number of hours that she works, which seems to be changing. That's one of the variables. And then she's got how much money she makes, which also seems to be changing in the two instances, right? So at one point she's making $40, sometimes she's making $100, sometimes she's working 2 hours, sometimes she's working 6 hours. This is a really good example for explaining the concept of independent and dependent, because a lot of you know, especially if you already have a part-time job or a friend who has one or you're looking for one, that the amount of money you make depends on how many hours you work. And so since this is the one that depends on that one right there, this is my y. The dependent, the amount of money that Amanda makes, depends on how many hours she works. And so as I change my work hours from week to week, or as my boss does, I will change the value of the money that I've made. So dependent is the key concept here. So if I come back and look at the information, I've got Amanda gets a job working for the city, and she makes $40 after she works for 2 hours. So these two numbers are grouped together. $40 being made after working for 2 hours. So now you need to think about, okay, well, which one's which? Well, we knew that the x is the hour. So she worked 2 hours. In those 2 hours, she made $40. Notice that I don't have to put them in the same order in the sentence, because over here it says after 6 hours she makes 100. So here I started with the money and I went to time. Down here I came to time and went over to money. It doesn't change anything, it's just the way the sentence is written. The big thing to know is which one depends on which. And just like the last time, that $100 that she made depended on the number of hours that she worked. Okay? Over here, there was my x, and that was my y. So 6 hours makes me $100. So those are the ordered pairs. The question says, given the following word problem, identify the independent and dependent variables, and then place the coordinates on the appropriate axis, and then sketch the line that represents the situation. So the next step then is to say, okay, well, after 2 hours, I made $40. Where does that happen? On the Cartesian plane. And then we'll take a look at connecting them up and making a line. So you can see that I'm going up by ones here, and I'm going up by a different number here. To get to that 50, I had to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces. And so those 5 spaces, if I go 50 divided by the 5 spaces, I get tens. So that means I went up by tens here. 10, 20, 30, 40, etc. And here I went up by ones. And remember, on the Cartesian plane, that's okay. You can go up by different amounts. It's just that once you pick what you're going up by on the x, it has to stay that way. And once you pick what you're going up by on the y, it has to stay that way. So 2 hours, $40 earned. 2 hours is your x. $40 earned is right there. And there's my first point, which is 240. I can label that. And the second point, 6 100, Well, here's where the x is 6, and here's where the y is 100. And so if you kind of think about where that 6 is going to meet that 100, that's going to be right there. And I'll label that one. 6 for the x, 100 for the y. And then the problem says, hey, take a second and sketch the line. So I can do that. And it's very important that when you're doing this, that you line it up as neatly as you can. And go ahead and make that line. Last thing I'll say is what's really neat about this line is now you can even kind of pick a number that we don't know for sure and find something. So for example, if you take a look, after 4 hours, let me use a different color here just to demonstrate this. After 4 hours, which, we don't know anything about what happens when the x is 4, but check it out. The line will tell us. If I find where the x is 4, and then I come all the way up until I touch that line right there, I can then come all the way over here and see that the y would have to be 70. And so that's one of the beauties of lines, is that they can actually help us answer questions about information that we know nothing about once we have the pattern set down.